organizers have given is the changing regulatory landscape, and we have the panels from different sectors over here. We have panelists from fintech, pharma, consumer electricals, so that we all get to know what all challenges they're facing from a different regulations perspective, and the DPDP Act, which is a common across all the sectors, how they can build up a common compliance framework to cover the obligations under their own sector-specific regulations and the DPDP Act. Everyone, here we are having a panel which is very different from whatever we have discussed as of today. Currently, we understand that compliance has to be done from a legal perspective, from a technical perspective, but from what this panel, the outcome will be that it is not only any legal obligation, it is not a compliance obligation, it is a business strategy overall from a business perspective that needs to be taken care with the evolving laws and the regulations we have. Now, if we talk about the Indian data privacy obligation, we have the DPDP Act. Prior to that, we had an IT Act. In the global regulations, we have the GDPR, we have CCP, and a lot of different obligations. So my first question will be to our panelist, Krithi, wherein for an organization which is operating globally in different jurisdictions, having different obligations from a data privacy perspective, how an organization can build a compliance framework so that it marries down every obligation of a different law of the land, and do not end up in having a different framework for each law.
Thank you so much for that question, Tej. So with respect to the question that has been directed, I'd like to address this in 2 points. One is, if the country already has a global presence across different regions, there is a good possibility, and this also stems from my experience of working with customers across India as well. There's a good possibility of them having an existing global framework, and especially organizations that might be compliant with GDPR or other regulations. The problem statement comes down to enhancing that framework, and that creates a lot of confusion internally within the stakeholders, considering that consent might operate very differently under GDPR or other regulations, and it operates significantly differently in the Indian regulation, which is the DPDPA. Now, with respect to how we can approach this, I think the objective is not to duplicate efforts. The objective is to build on what is already in place. And that could also be in terms of enhancing an existing automation tool to ensure that the workflow is streamlined efficiently to meet the DPDPA requirements. It could also be internal alignment of stakeholders, because a lot of compliance challenges comes if there is no coordination between the global teams and the Indian local teams. So that kind of alignment would help a lot. And this is not just with consent. There's an aspect of data processing agreement as well, which can be differently drafted under GDPR, and it can be differently drafted under DPDPA, because the technical measures that need to be added as annexures are also very different under the rules. So it needs to be a layered approach, but at the same time, it needs to take into consideration that the existing framework needs to be enhanced, and it can't be duplicated to an extent where internal conflicts can be created.
Thanks for these views. So keeping the automation in mind and building upon the existing framework, my next question will be for Sujay, wherein coming from a fintech industry, there are a lot of conflicts within the regulations across the globe, and some of the times there may be differences between or conflicts between the different data privacy obligations. So how compliance architecture can be built so that the data privacy obligations and the compliance obligations, which usually conflict with each other, doesn't have any impact on the organization?
Yeah, I mean, very pertinent. Hello? Yeah, okay. I think it's a very pertinent question. So just as a background, we are a TSP, or a technical service provider, to financial services industry. We have presence in around 20 countries as customers. we have a lot of all the regulations which were talked about in the previous presentation and more across geographies. The challenge obviously is interpretation. I think the biggest challenge we are seeing in regulation is really interpretation by customers. So even if it's a single regulation, we end up having multiple interpretations of that. Apart from the fact that you are dealing with multiple geographies and multiple regulations. The way we have approached it is really going in two ways. One is we have looked at using microservices. So all our services, all our software works in a microservices way. So each component comes in or goes out in a solution as and when required. We've also developed a horizontal capability, tooling to handle privacy. So whether that is in terms of data encryption, permissions, we have things like BYOK and have the keys managed by the customers. So with those capabilities, what we are able to do is we are able to customize to some extent for every regulation and for every customer as well. The challenging part comes more in the contractual part of it, on really going to and having a discussion with the customer and agreeing on what we're going to do. How do we make sure that we are sitting within obligations of ours which are compliant to the regulation as well as something we can deliver on and not deviate from. Again, more closer home, we are an India first company. We are based in, we started in India, now we have gone abroad. DPDPA, we are seeing the same kind of things being replayed again. We have interpretations and more interpretations coming. But I think in the way we have architected our solutions, we have architected our horizontals, we are able to manage all of that. One important thing, we as processors, we don't have the obligation of consent. So as consent, we are keeping it very, very thin layer in terms of just keeping the final record, but the consent is something which the customers manage.
Thanks, Sujay. So this gave a very nice idea of having a horizontal DPDPA or any privacy obligations. So keeping that in mind, the next question is for Arjun, coming from a pharma industry wherein the pharmaceutical have their own sector-specific regulations in place, and there will be an overlap between the sector-specific regulations and the DPDP obligations. So how you have a compliance framework in place so that you fulfill all the requirements of that specific regulatory obligation from that industry, and the DPDP obligations are also met?
Sure. So see, this mainly is with respect to the clinical trials. Now CDSCO provides the drug approvals. ICMR is the Indian Council of Medical Research. They take care of the research part, that how clinical trials are conducted. Now already this particular area is quite heavily regulated under the new clinical drug trial rules. The difference comes in the format of the consent. So ICMR guidelines already has an informed consent concept, and they have a specific template. So companies have to use that template in order to obtain the ethics committee approval. The difference is that under DPDP rules, now we also have to tell the data principal about the rights which the data subject and the data principal would have. Those kind of nuances are not currently there in ICMR guidelines. So that particular gap, in my view, either the DPDP Act provides a legitimate use basis legal obligation like it is there in GDPR, or this can also get confirmed, this can also get taken care of if the ICMR guidelines are updated. So it is not just about how the DPDP Act can be amended or how they can provide a clarification. The sectoral regulators, in my view, also need to come up with their respective clarifications. Because the Act is industry agnostic, so we cannot expect that they should have some amendments for pharma, some amendments specifically for telecom. So I think the sectoral regulators need to now come in where they should update their own templates, and specifically at this point, the ICMR guidelines can be updated for the consent part. So one is that. The other is pharmacovigilance. Pharmacovigilance is basically the adverse event reporting. So if a patient consumes the drug and has a side effect, it needs to get reported. So over there, it is easier to obtain the consent today when the patient is coming to us. It makes it difficult where the doctor is reporting on behalf of the patient. Because in that case, The doctor cannot provide a consent from the patient. Once we get the data, then we reach out to the patient and get the consent. So this particular gap which is there, again, if the DPDP Act, since these sectoral laws are quite strict, legitimate use as a legal obligation, if that comes into the picture, then that would be really helpful. As of now, there is also a discussion that in pharmacovigilance, because the patient is only calling the company, it might get categorized under legitimate use under voluntary information. So because the patient is coming voluntarily and giving the information, whether it is through the doctor or directly to us, that is the only aspect in the DPDP Act which I see which can govern from it currently. Otherwise, the bigger challenge I see is in the PV obligations. And lastly, the current issue is that until and unless the ICMR, till the time ICMR guidelines are not updated, do we take two different consent formats? Do we amend the ICMR guidelines ourselves, the ICMR consent form ourselves? Because if we do that, then the ethics committee may come to the conclusion that we have not taken an adequate informed consent as prescribed under the ICMR guidelines. So I think some combination of sectoral updates as well as legitimate use as legal obligation, if that gets taken care of by the Act, then it would be very helpful.
Thanks for these views. Coming back to the pharma sector itself, unlike GDPR, DPDPA does not classify personal data into any different categories of the data. So GDPR has the health data or the records of the patients and the genetic data. And if we talk about the Indian landscape, every data will fall under the same standard. So what do you foresee? Will there be any consequences of this data falling under the whole standard?
Sure. So I get this question a lot. And see, on the face of it, it may seem that there is no classification of health data, therefore there is something wrong. But if we really deep dive into the differences between GDPR and DPDP Act, so GDPR, first of all, says that all sensitive information, including health data, requires a specific written consent. Under DPDP, consent is required for all types of data. So that gets taken care of there. The second aspect in GDPR is that health data should be encrypted. Under DPDP rules, we have to encrypt all kinds of personal data. The main differentiation factor is that GDPR talks about data privacy impact assessment, which is like a risk assessment of the kind of data which is coming into the organization. And if there is a vendor, then a risk assessment of the vendor. That in DPDP Act is not specifically talked about for health data. That is only for significant data fiduciaries. So today we don't know who all will be a SPD, the significant data fiduciary. In case the clinical research organizations and R&D centers are declared as a significant data fiduciary, then this DPIA difference will also get taken care of. Otherwise, that is the only difference which I see. The basics of consent, encryption, etc., those are already getting taken care of.
Thanks for these valuable insights. So now, so that everyone is not bored, we know that how the data has to be captured. We need to have consents in place. What about if any incident happens, and what are the next steps any organization has to do? So my next question is for Yogesh, wherein CERTIN has its own requirements of reporting if any incident happens. DPDPA coming up with their own timelines. How do you foresee that, keeping in mind, since any organization which is operating globally, having said that every regulation or a law will have separate set of requirements of reporting, how an organization can deal with these kind of requirements?
So basically, certain requirement is to, when there is a breach, right? You need to notify within 6 hours. That is what is the requirement is all about. But specifically in the manufacturing industry, if you take a case of our IoT or OT environment, they are not yet prepared. Like in enterprise IT environment, right? You already have the visibility wherever there is any breach, right? So you can identify the scope of the breach. You know the identifiable systems. You know the cloud storages, database, file servers. Right? So you can identify the scope in case of enterprise IT, but specifically if I could take a case of IoT, it's very difficult because there are millions of users using the mobile applications. Then there is a lot of platforms, integrated platforms, where is the data is transmitting, and of course the third-party platforms. So in that case, the preparedness is not there, at least to update in a 6 hours time. Because specifically, if you take a case of again OT, right? So there's a lot of issue with the visibility, because normally an OT sector, it's handled by the OT people, and there is a IT-OT collaboration is required specifically. If I take an example, say if there is an tomorrow malfunction happens in PLC, right? So normally that case is normally troubleshooted by the OT team first. Then it goes to the OEMs, then it comes to the IT, and then maybe the InfoSec if there is a malware injection happens, right? So this entire detection and then response itself will take time. So it is very difficult, rather demanding or aggressive to notify in a 6 hours times to the certain for the breach notification, I can say.
So taking a one step back, before any incident, we need to safeguard the data. Under the DPDP Act, it states that organizations need to have reasonable security measures in place. But how do you translate this open-ended reasonable word in terms of the security of personal data?
Yeah. So when you say the reasonable, it's again open texture, right? Open-ended. So there's no specific controls mentioned, or there's no encryption standard or architecture reference is given, right? So in that case, organizations are flexible. But then what is the challenge? Challenge is audit challenge, right? But if the organization having some framework like ISO 27001, right? Then at least that is a best framework, at least as far as the security concern. It will be a risk-based approach, definitely identifying your assets and identifying your vulnerabilities and threats, and then accordingly, depending upon your likelihood and impact, then you have a proportionate controls. But then with the ISO 27001, there's a challenge that again the audit cycle, right? So it normally does in every annually. So and there are a lot of new data processing happening over the period of, and there are also a lot of regulatory changes happening, right? So considering that, determining the security and privacy posture is a challenge for ISO 27001. But if you have ISO 27001 and ISO 27701, that is specifically for the privacy, then you have a significant compliance, because there it will take care of your obligations for your data fiduciary and data principles, be it policies or a data subject rights management or a third-party risk, combining all. Again, coming back to the IoT or OT segment, there again it's again a challenge for specifically for these controls, because then the reasonable controls are the compensatory control, is to reduce the attack surface and reduce the blast radius. Because of the legacy systems in the OT environment, where you can't patch it, right? You don't have an entire visibility of the protocols which are running under the OT environment. So definitely the compensatory controls is the key for that segment.
Thanks. So we understand that from under the DPDP, all the obligations to safeguard the data is on a data fiduciary. So now, coming from a technology service provider perspective, you act as a data processor wherein you handle a lot of financial data of clients across the globe. So, and whenever any client comes which is having a very weaker governance standard from your organization, how do you handle these kind of situations, since they will put all the contractual obligations on the data processor?
That's a great question, right? Firstly, I think financial services industry as such is built on trust. And that's something we take very seriously. We take data protection as regulated across the globe, and especially with RBI, again, it's top of mind. So we take data protection very, very seriously, and we have our minimum standards which we follow regardless of what our customers do, right? The second thing that we do is we also move to a completely API-based architecture. So the integrations are such that we are creating air gaps between our systems and the systems of the thing. So from a data protection point of view, we are well covered. If you look at some of the obligations which come on the privacy side, however, those are the ones where it gets a little tricky, because there are certain obligations which come on to us, which as a processor, it's very difficult for us to comply with, or there's no clarity on it, right? And I think that's where a lot of discussions happen. Standardization of a product is there. We also, what we do is we expose our entire layer of protection, what we have, our policies, etc., to our customers. And we get into a very detailed conversation, and obviously we are right to audit is always there, on what we will do and what we will not do. So those lines we draw very clearly, with the clear emphasis that we ourselves are, for our own sake, like if my reputation is on, if on the line, and then my reputation is critical for me to get more business and grow. So I think that baseline which we have is pretty high to begin with. And we also make sure that our obligations are also very clearly understood by the customer. And from a security point of view, we are keeping those air gaps. But it's a very interesting question, because there are layers to this as well, right? Yeah. And
So, since till the time there are a lot of rules which are yet to be, a lot of things which the board will be established, and then they will give the final standards and the guidelines. Till that time, since an organization will need to have a standard governance framework, how the governance framework should be set up in the absence of these standards?
so at this point in time, since we are already in regions which have got privacy laws, we have gone ahead and we have complied to those. So what we really have to really look at is what is the delta that's going to come out. So that baseline is already pretty high. So GDPR as a baseline is already met as far as we are concerned. What is the delta? What will that come out is something we will have to wait for that to come. But in terms of getting to a baseline, we are already there.
So, coming back to the other requirement wherein there will be a lot of countries will be given by the board itself, the permitted list of countries. So till the time this is absent, what an organization should do, and any global organization should do, where the operations are or the clients are based out of different jurisdictions and which may fall under the blacklisted countries, how the organizations should prepare themselves so that whenever these countries are published, the organizations should not face any consequences.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think we can backtrack a little bit with this question in terms of data transfers. The problem today with most organizations in India, at least, is understanding where transfer exists. So, organizations are still identifying what the personal data lifecycle could potentially look like. Whether there is internal transfers between departments, whether there is any cross-border transfer, even if it's a GCC, right? They might have entities operating out of India, but they might be headquartered in another country, which could be in the EU region or the US region. There could be an evident transfer involved there, or there could be cross-border transfer for any other reasons. It could even be in terms of storage. A lot of organizations today need to identify where exactly this transfer is taking place. And since India right now doesn't have a set standard or defined regulatory requirements with respect to how these transfers can be managed, I think one thing that can serve as a reference under the rules in itself would be the security safeguards. Once the transfer is identified, it would be reasonable for the organization to understand the risk involved in that transfer. So taking, a reference to maybe the EU GDPR and conducting a transfer impact assessment to understand what kind of a risk could be there, and categorize the high-risk transfers from the other, transfers that are undertaken, could help them in implementing the appropriate safeguards which have already been defined under the rules. Apart from that, I think contracts in itself would serve as a good legal, safeguard, considering that most transfers can be governed contractually. And this also boils down to how exactly these contracts could be negotiated, right? Because a lot of times when these contracts are being negotiated, a lot gets into the gray area, even if it's in terms of indemnity for breach, or it's in terms of what kind of security safeguards an organization already has in place. And one clause which interestingly has a lot of backlash is right to audit, because everyone knows that if it gets down to the position of an audit, things have gone haywire, right? So ensuring that these contracts are defined in a way wherein the transfers can be safeguarded appropriately could be a few measures that can be taken up by the organizations until and unless they have a good reference or the central government notifies what are the blacklisted countries.
Thanks, Kirti. So Arjun, coming from a pharma industry, there are a lot of global drug development programs in place, which requires a lot of cross-border data transfer, such as clinical trials or health-related data. So what kind of cross-border data transfer architecture should be in place to handle these kind of situations?
So I believe you're referring to whether data can be transferred from India to other jurisdictions. So see, unlike GDPR, which follows a whitelist model that you can transfer data only to certain jurisdiction which the GDPR notifies, we follow a blacklist model, which means you can transfer it anywhere unless government specifically debars us to transfer to a particular jurisdiction. Now, practically speaking, most of the pharma MNCs who are doing these trials in India, they are from US and Europe, all the big pharma companies, the multinational corporations. And I think it is safe to say that we will definitely not blacklist US and Europe. So since the most of the trials are being done through those countries, I think we are quite safe. There are some trials through companies in Japan, some of it is in South Korea and in Australia as well. But I don't foresee having the major jurisdictions not getting covered. And apart from these major jurisdictions, in case there is some business or some work coming from some smaller jurisdictions, and because of any national security reasons or any other data security reasons, if the government does blacklist that, I think that is some business cost. We should respect those particular aspects which the government comes up with, because at the end of the day, the DPDP Act does not stem from a business requirement. It is there because right to privacy is a fundamental right. So owing to that, if because of security reasons there is some blacklisting and because of that there is some business disruption, that would be much lesser because maximum work is coming from advanced jurisdictions. The bigger problem which I see is again going back to the informed consent. The formats that are currently being used, now we will have to update them not just to include the general data privacy related data subject rights, but also cross-border transfers. So that also need to get updated in the privacy notices and the consents that in such kind of clinical trials, we will be sharing the data outside of India.
Thanks, Arjun. There are a lot of scenarios wherein a few companies have mergers in place, wherein the data moves from one organization to other organization, and since the organization which have to give the data to the one who is acquiring the organization will have a lot of data which they have collected in the past with no informed consent of the customer. What kind of risks, so this question is open for every panelist, wherein what kind of risks do you envisage when these kind of mergers happens, and what steps or what kind of precautions needs to be taken by any organization?
Okay, so I'll go first. With respect to pharma, I again don't see much of a challenge from a clinical trial perspective because in all the jurisdictions it is something which is already heavily regulated. I see a bigger issue for doctor data because the pharma reps visit doctors and they have personal information. So how that company is collecting that information and storing it. At the same time, there are some patient support programs. So there could be applications or websites where the patients are going. So it again comes back to a normal due diligence. So it is, see, in a M&A transaction, the main company who is acquiring the other company, we are taking in all the liabilities, not just data privacy, but a lot of other liabilities as well. So we need to do a proper due diligence, and also under the DPDP Act, there is exception given for mergers and demergers that if there is any data transfer owing to a merger or demerger, which has already been approved by the court, then the consent-related aspects get taken care of automatically through that. I think it is section 17, if I'm not wrong. So that is already a relief which is there. However, that relief kicks in once the merger is approved by the court. Before that, during due diligence, I think having a data online record and not asking for the data to be transferred. Like there are online systems through which you can just view the data. So those kind of safeguards can be put in during due diligence, and later on, of course, after the court order is there, then there will not be any issue in getting that data. That's from my side.
Thanks, Arjun. From a board perspective or the approvals perspective, this is covered. So, Krithi, if you can shed some light from a notice perspective, how these mergers can deal with the consent part of the sharing.
Sure. So with respect to acquisition, I think, or merger, an interesting example that I had come across last year when, the act was not really into effect was the merger between Air India and Vistara, right? I think there was a public notice that was provided for in every newspaper or anything that was publicly accessible that there is going to be a transfer of information, and this is how, the organization is going to handle that information. I think that was a good initiative in terms of ensuring that the audience or the relevant principals are informed. But of course, when it comes down to the nitty-gritties of how DPDPA looks into it, of course, when there's a merger, demerger, or when there's an acquisition, the purpose of using that data automatically changes. And whenever there's a change in the purpose, whenever there's any kind of change in how the data is being dealt with, there is a requirement of a fresh notice that will be triggered to the data principals, and that needs to be done. Interestingly enough, the notice has to be accompanying the consent request. So how consent would be dealt with will also be decentralized, or it will be looked at from a different perspective if it's a merger, because there's a good possibility of organizations having their own policies, procedures, workflows of how they deal with consent internally. So they'll either have to align it accordingly, or they'll have to sort of decentralize and bring in their own frameworks to ensure that consent is granular, it's purpose specific, and it's in line with what the Act requires. And one key thing also comes in terms of informing the data principals who they can reach out to if they have to raise any request or if they need to sort of raise any grievances. So that, again, comes in with the notice very interestingly, and that needs to be a key element of any kind of communication that goes out to the public. With all of this being said and done, I think accountability stands at the forefront of any kind of mergers, demergers, or acquisition, because an organization would already have a set framework in place in terms of who's responsible for what internally. There could be a legal team that's responsible for certain aspects of notice, or there could be another team in charge to ensure that that notice is published, or how consent is managed, collected, stored, recorded, right? So translating that accountability in a manner where the operations are not impacted even after a merger, demerger, or acquisition becomes an extremely important element in dealing with this control.
Awesome. So to conclude with this panel, I would like to ask every panel one question is which, looking ahead of the next 3 years, upcoming 3 years, and the regulations are changing in a very fast pace. What kind of capability and organizations should build today so that they are growing with the changing regulations? We can start with Sujay.
Okay, I'll start. So from a regulation perspective, if the legitimate use aspect, if a legal obligation has a legitimate purpose for collecting of the personal data, if that gets clarified, then that would be helpful. From an infrastructure perspective, I think there should be a digitization which companies should look at, having a tool which helps in managing the entire data life cycle, where the consent is stored, how to do the data discovery and data mapping. That digital tools, I think, is most required right now. Right now itself, not just in the next 3 years. That is something which is immediately required.
Framework agnostic security controls is what is important, so that even if there are different regulatory challenges, be it industry specific, DPDP, certain anything, if you have the specific controls in place that will suffice the requirement. As well as definitely for the supply chain due diligence is also one of the important.
In the B2B space, I think a little trickier because, as I said earlier, there's a lot of interpretations has come. What we have done pretty well is we have looked at multiple standards and figured out what is the highest standard for each of our aspects, and we have made our policies in line with that. So that gives us a little bit of headroom in case something comes, and we are most likely ahead of that. We've also built a horizontal for the privacy aspect, which goes across all our different verticals. But I think the real resilience is basically flexibility. If your systems are flexible, if you have built a lot of things based on parameters, based on APIs, and that's what we have learned, that investment which we did in our architecture of a system is actually paying dividends now, because we're able to react and respond to the different types of requirements that are coming, not only from regulations and from the interpretations of the regulations as well. So yeah, I think flexibility in your systems is probably what has helped us.
Sure. I think to add on, for me, it would be sensitization of privacy in general across stakeholders. And this also comes from a place where, a lot of stakeholders, even in the legal IT, because these are the prominent departments that have major buy-in when it comes to ensuring that privacy is implemented across different departments. Even if they understand the applicability, even if they understand the importance of it and what could be the consequences if there's a non-compliance, sort of translating that requirement across different departments becomes a key challenge. Sales or marketing, for example, they might have their own need to have that data in place or to use that data, and they might not be very keen with compliance with DPDPA in general, right? Because it's always looked at as an additional burden or a requirement. So the minute you can, you get into a position where you can simplify it for the stakeholders, get their buy-in and have their active participation, I think that's where privacy becomes, truly functional across an organization. So that's my take.
Thanks, everyone. So if the time permits us, we can have 2-3 questions from the audience, if anyone has any questions.
Yes, audience. Yeah, we have the mic there.
Do you see any AI impact on the privacy? Be it medical field, be it software field, BFSI. Do you see any impact on the AI?
So impact from perspective of how
Privacy,
to
of course.
No, that I understand. So how the data is being collected through a
Yes.
AI module, you're saying? Okay. Yeah. So I think whether it is AI or whether it is general tools, the principles will remain the same. So yeah, in the sense that if we have an AI bot for any HR related aspect, so what we have to see is automated decision making is one particular aspect. A lot of HR professionals, they use AI for recruitment. So over there, I would say again, how the consent is taken, how the bot is managing that would be there. From a research perspective, I don't see much issue over there because for drug discovery, AI is being used in pharma. However, that does not involve any personal information. That is purely science, and that is only for scientific purpose, that how the molecules are reacting with each other. The more use case I see in all the other support functions, like HR could be one, legal could be one. So over there, we have to make sure that how that particular software or how that AI model is built. So I'll give you one example from a compliance perspective. We do compliance monitoring of all the business transactions. Business transactions in the sense that any scientific conferences where doctors attend, we take photographs, attendance sheets, etc. And there was one particular consultant who came up with a AI monitoring system, that in case there is any duplication in the photographs, that bot will be able to tell us. And this is something which is global. Now, while it sounds very good, but when we ask them about the transparency requirements, that how that particular model is actually functioning, then I did not get a proper response. And especially when such kind of vendors are coming in and saying that Because now, you know, a lot of vendors come and say AI because AI is the buzzword. They will put something in AI and then they will say that, yeah, this can help you in your compliance fraud detection globally. And when you ask them that, okay, how is it helping in compliance with the EU AI Act, nobody has any answer. So as compliance professional, I would say that if any such module is coming to me, I would like to understand that how it was built, what is the transparency, how is the fairness, and what is the information they can give. Because when you ask them that how the algorithm works, they say that is confidential. Now that does not really help. That is in fact a red flag for me. Because it is not just about the business information, but also personal information. So from my side, I would say that we have to make sure that it has adequate transparency built in, and they should be able to share the basic architecture of that tool.
I'll just add one point, right? So end of the day, there are AIs which have gone rogue as well. So I think that level of security built in. So what we have done as an example is we make sure any data that AI is exposed to is already obfuscated. So that is the level of security we put. So if it goes rogue as well, the impact is actually not on the privacy part of it. Then there are measures and measurements we can take after that to then, ensure that the end compliance is met. But yeah, as long as we are not exposing, PI data to an AI, we're okay. But I think that's specific to our industry. Other industries would have other challenges.
Yeah, a lot of data is getting exchanged, okay, over the AI. It includes the PI data. So you need to have AI governance and AI security policies in place. Controls like DLP is required. So to answer, it has an impact.
Okay, thanks everyone. With this, we will conclude the panel.
Thank you so much, amazing panelists.